The 9,937th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Syrian Arab Republic, Turkey, and Yemen to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Najat Rochdi, Deputy Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, Ms. Joyce Masuya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Ms. Amna Khoulani, Human Rights Defender and Executive Director of Adalati Center. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Najat Rochdi.
Madam President, it's an honor to brief the Security Council. Let me at the outset echo the Secretary General's condemnation of any military escalation in the Middle East and his call on Israel and Iran to show maximum restraint. I must convey to this Council the Special Envoy's profound and growing alarm over the potential consequences of any further escalation, not only for the broader region, but particularly for Syria, a country already stretched beyond the limits. Syria simply cannot withstand another wave of instability. The risks of further escalation in the region are not hypothetical. They are immediate, severe, and risk unraveling the fragile progress toward peace and recovery in Syria. Madam President, Special Envoy Pedersen spent much of the reporting period in Damascus, as well as a short visit to Lebanon. While in Damascus, he met with the range of senior Syrian officials, including the interim ministers of Foreign Affairs, Interior, Justice, Education, Higher Education, the chair of the Civil Peace Committee, as well as the governor of the Central Bank. Discussions with the interim Foreign Minister Shaybani focused on recent positive developments in Syria's international relations and the importance of prioritizing domestic affairs in the coming period via a genuinely inclusive and credible political transition in which all Syrians have a stake and can have confidence. The meetings with him and all other Syrian officials were marked by a constructive and cooperative tone with a shared interest in strengthening engagement with the United Nations across multiple sectors. Particular attention was given to the next steps in the transition and the coordinating efforts with the newly established committees on transitional justice and missing persons. More broadly, discussions focused on ways to strengthen collaboration between the interim authorities and the Office of the Special Envoy in support of these initiatives. In discussions with the interim ministers of Interior and Justice, the Special Envoy also noted the clear willingness to undertake comprehensive institutional reforms aimed at modernization and development. Madam President, as the Special Envoy discussed in Damascus, an important next step in the political transition is the establishment of the new People's Assembly as the transitional legislative authority. In this regard, we welcome the recent presidential decree that, in line with the constitutional declaration, announced the appointment of a Supreme Committee for Elections to the People's Assembly. The Supreme Committee will be responsible for supervising the indirect election of 150 members of the People's Assembly via electoral colleges, and for defining the electoral timeframe and eligibility conditions for electors and candidates. We encourage the Supreme Committee to take measures that safeguard inclusivity, transparency, and openness in all stages of this process. Such further efforts will be needed to ensure that the People's Assembly is seen as a foundation of political consensus, a stabilizing factor, and representative of the unity and diversity of the nation and all its components. We also particularly encourage measures to be taken that enable the meaningful participation of women and youth in this process. We very much look forward to continued engagement with and support the interim authorities and the Supreme Committee. We also look forward to engaging with Syrians from across diverse sectors of society to hear respective views on these developments and their broader aspirations for the political process. Madam President, regarding the Northeast, the 10 March agreement continues to present a historical opportunity to solve one of the key outstanding issues in this conflict and restore Syria's sovereignty and unity, a priority which the Special Envoy discussed with Interim Foreign Minister Shaybani. We have been deepening engagement in Damascus and the Northeast in support of the efforts to move forward in implementing the agreement and welcome the engagement of all relevant parties with us. We take note of the meetings that have been taking place on implementation, including a meeting of delegations in early June in Damascus. We welcome progress on education with an agreement for students to register for exams in the Northeast under the auspices of the Interim Ministry of Education. We also welcome recent detainee exchanges as well as the cooperation that recently enabled the number of Syrian families from Al-Hol camp to return to Northwest Syria. We must stress that urgent work is still needed on rehabilitation to address the dire humanitarian conditions and fragile security situation in the camp, and for member states and relevant authorities to significantly step up efforts on repatriations. Sufficient attention should also be paid to the proper reintegration of Syrian camp residents. We stress the importance of negotiations moving forward in earnest with bold steps and an active spirit of compromise from both sides to implement the 10th of March agreement. This is a priority for stability in Syria and the region, for the restoration of Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity, and for the success of the overall political transition. Madam President, the Special Envoy also engaged in a broad spectrum of Syrians, including women and civil society activists. Syrian women indicate that they continue to seek more substantial representation in leadership positions and that they look forward to a consequential role as candidates and delegates in the upcoming legislative bodies process. Furthermore, Syrian women continue to stress the importance of justice and accountability, inclusivity, due process, and protection of individual rights of all Syrians. Syrian civil society representatives also continue to be active on all of inclusivity, openness, and transparent participatory processes. We welcome their engagement in consolidating civil peace, and we encourage the interim authorities to cultivate broad dialogue with a range of civil society organizations to promote social cohesion, counter hate speech, and foster reconciliation among communities and across regions. Indeed, the protection and safety of all components of Syrian society and the prevention of incitements of communal tensions are absolute cornerstones for stability. During the reporting period, sporadic violent incidents continued in Homs, Hama, the coastal areas, and other regions, including killing, kidnapping, and infringements on individual liberties. Some Syrians with whom the special envoy met in Damascus expressed concern about ongoing attacks targeting specific communities and societal groups, including Alawites, Jews, and women. While many interlocutors emphasized that these incidents did not appear to be systematic or part of official policy, they highlighted the persistent challenges faced by the interim authorities in controlling certain groups, whether affiliated with the interim authorities or operating independently. Nevertheless, there are encouraging signs. The interim authorities have taken steps to ease tension, including the recent issuance of a fatwa by the Fatwa Council prohibiting revenge killings and extrajudicial retaliation, urging citizens to resolve disputes through official legal channels and criminalizing acts of retribution. Recent decisions to reinstate judges who were removed from office by the former regime are also a welcome step towards building trust between the judiciary and the people. Further key steps will be needed towards the reinforcement of the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary, so it is equipped and enabled to address past, present, and future violations and install a culture of accountability. We encourage an inclusive and participatory approach to issues of accountability and security, namely with the victims, the survivors, and communities impacted by violations. Madam President, there are security challenges on several other axes. This month, we saw some sporadic and limited acts of violence on the periphery of Suwaida, at a border post with Iraq, on contact lines in Deir ez-Zor and in rural Homs. Meanwhile, the Southwest saw a serious incident of Israeli artillery fire and airstrikes on military sites and weapons depots across southern Syria in response to a rare incident of small rocket fires out of Syria into the Israeli-occupied Syrian Golan, claimed by two groups unaffiliated with the interim authorities. The interim authorities denied any involvement in the rocket fire. Last week, there were Israeli incursions, arrests, and drone strikes in Beijing, in the Damascus countryside. These attacks are unacceptable and must cease. Syria's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity must be respected, along with the 1974 disengagement of forces agreement. Diplomacy is possible and must be prioritized. Ongoing activity by ISIL remain notable, including attacks on SDF positions and a US drone strike on an ISIL figure in northwest Syria. Meanwhile, as the Special Envoy has reminded the Council on many occasions, concrete action to address the core issue of foreign fighters is also needed, with many continuing to express concern about their inclusion in the Syrian army, even as we also recognize that this is a challenging issue. Madam President, we also take note of the statement made by the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs regarding recent missions to Syria by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and welcome the meaningful cooperation underway. OCHA will update you on the continued precarious humanitarian situation across the country by my dear sister, ASG Joyce. We note that despite the fragile security and socio-economic situation, almost 600,000 Syrians are estimated to have crossed back into Syria, overwhelmingly from neighboring countries in the past 6 months. This positive trend is equally observed in the return of internally displaced persons. An estimated 1.16 million IDPs have returned to their areas of origin during the same period. Whether these returns are sustainable will depend on many factors, including on the availability of housing, public services, infrastructure, and the revitalization of the economy. On this note, it was heartening to see last week the permanent closure of the Rukban camp, and one hopes that this will be the fate of all displacement camps in the country and in the neighboring states. We continue to welcome and encourage international moves that contribute to economic reactivation. This month saw the issuance of a US general license as well as a 6-month waiver in relation to the Caesar sanctions. These steps, together with the lifting of the EU economic sanction in May and of the UK in April, authorize a broad range of transactions intended to facilitate commercial activity across key sectors of the Syrian economy. We also take note of the signing of a large commercial contract between a consortium of regional and international players and the Syrian interim authorities for the construction of several gas and solar energy plants. Upon completion, these projects are expected to supply more than half of Syria's national electricity needs, representing a big leap toward energy security, economic revival, and infrastructure resilience. Such moves hold major potential to improve living conditions across the country. But a lot more needs to be done for the private sector to tap into this potential, including addressing other remaining sanctions, establishing an adequate regulatory and financial framework, and furthering and enabling security and political environments that can effectively attract investment and international business. We welcome Syria re-engaging with international financial institutions, including the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Indeed, the latter paid its first visit to Syria since 2009, earlier this month, and emphasized that the country will need substantial international support for its effort to rehabilitate the economy, meet urgent humanitarian needs, and rebuild essential institutions and infrastructure. Madam President, the Special Envoy and I will shortly return to Syria to continue direct engagement with the interim authorities and a broad cross-section of Syrian society. We will continue to support the interim authorities and the Syrian people towards a new and a better chapter in Syria's history and a fully inclusive transition in line with the principles of Security Council Resolution 2254, one that restores Syria's sovereignty and unity and meets the aspiration of the Syrian people. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. Rochdi for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Joyce Msuya.
Thank you, Madam President. As Deputy Special Envoy, my colleague Najat Rochdi has just set out, the people of Syria continue to navigate a dizzying mixture of challenges and opportunities as they pursue a better future. Today, I want to offer another reminder of what is at stake and highlight 4 main points for this Council's attention. First, We must keep a strong focus on the scale of the humanitarian crisis in Syria, which remains one of the largest in the world. While the reduction in conflict and growing engagement with international partners are opening new prospects for investing in Syria's future, we must not forget that 3/4 of the population still need humanitarian relief right now. Security remains volatile in parts of the country, including the coast, the south, and the northeast, where attacks continue to affect civilians and humanitarian operations. Over 7 million people remain displaced, including many newly uprooted by recent violence. Over 1.1 million internally displaced people, along with more than 500,000 refugees, have returned in the past 6 months. But many of them will still rely on humanitarian aid, including early recovery support, as they work to rebuild their lives. Unexploded ordnance remains a deadly threat, killing at least 414 people and injuring close to 600 more since December. A third of these victims are children. This threat is also a key concern for displaced people who want to return to their homes. Health systems remain overwhelmed, with fewer than 60% of hospitals and less than half of primary healthcare centers fully functional. As we enter the warmer months, the cholera outbreak risks getting worse due to population movements, disruptions to water systems, and drought. Syria, along with much of the region, is experiencing its worst dry spell in more than 3 decades. This will likely shrink agricultural output with up to 3/4 of its wheat crop, enough to feed 16 million people for a year, at risk of failure at a time when more than half of the population already faces food insecurity. Madam President, my second point, the UN and its partners continue to do what we can to provide critical assistance and make the most efficient use of the limited resources we have. We are now in the last stages of transitioning to a more efficient and unified humanitarian coordination model, one that harnesses the efforts of organizations working across the country under the leadership of the humanitarian coordinator in Damascus. These efforts were also supported through a joint mission between OCHA's Director of Operations and Advocacy and the World Health Organization's Director of Health Emergency Interventions in late May. This revised structure is now largely in place. The coordination mechanisms in Gaziantep and Amman, which have been so critical to our ability to provide assistance throughout Syria over the years, will be phased out by the end of the month. Through this transition, we have reached close to 2.5 million people with critical assistance each month, including food, water, and health, despite shrinking funding. This includes, for example, close to 2 million people reached each month with health interventions. This year, the World Health Organization has supported over 2.7 million causes of treatment and more than 430,000 medical procedures. The Syria Humanitarian Fund is supporting health, water, and sanitation services for 850,000 people at risk of cholera in Aleppo, Damascus, Al-Hasake, and Latakia. The fund has also launched a 60 million joint allocation with the Syria Cross-Border Humanitarian Fund to assist displaced populations, host communities, and returnees. UNICEF, WHO, and other partners are providing mobile health and nutrition services in underserved areas. In May, over 170,000 young children and pregnant and breastfeeding women were screened for malnutrition, with a particular focus on the coastal areas. Thousands of explosive items have been discarded in clearance operations, improving people's safety as well as access for humanitarian actors. We continue to make use of the most cost-efficient routes available. This includes the route from Turkey, through which the UN has transported over 1,200 trucks of aid this year, more than 6 times as many as the same period last year. In May, assistance transported along this route benefited over 1.2 million people across much of Syria. The World Food Programme is sourcing more supplies locally, driven by changes in the exchange rate. Meanwhile, our teams are exploring how the recent announcements by the US, UK, EU, and others to ease sanctions can help us further streamline transactions and procurement and expand access to items like advanced medical equipment. However, and this is my third point, we need more funding to keep this work going, if not to expand it. Nearly halfway through the year, our humanitarian appeal has received only $260 million, just 14% of the requirements for this period. At a time when NGOs have new opportunities to expand their activities across Syria, many are instead forced to scale back. This continues to translate into reductions in critical activities. Across Syria, 280 health facilities, 16% of the total, have suspended or reduced capacity due to funding cuts affecting all 14 governorates. In northern Syria, 240 health facilities risk closing due to funding cuts, potentially affecting more than 4.2 million people. Some 24 safe spaces for women and girls have been shuttered, and an estimated 265,000 people will lose access to life-saving reproductive health services. Other sectors face equally stark challenges. This year, we have already narrowed our focus to target 8 million of the most vulnerable people in Syria, less than half of the total number in need. In light of the global funding context, we will continue to adjust our operations in line with the humanitarian reset laid out by the Emergency Relief Coordinator in March. But this will ultimately mean doing less with less. My final point, Madam President, is that we must translate this moment into concrete support for Syria's reconstruction and development. For our part, as humanitarians, we will continue to see through the shift to more efficient ways of working with simplified structures, growing partnerships with local actors, and a sharpened focus on the most critical life savings needs to help ensure the most vulnerable are not passed by. But the people of Syria want to move beyond dependence on aid and to rebuild their own livelihoods. As more families return home, demand for healthcare, education, water, and electricity will only grow. As Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi has stated, recent moves to ease sanction open new opportunities for investment in restoring critical services. Recent announcements of planned investments and the growing engagement by international financial institutions are encouraging. The UN has also proposed areas for possible development activities in support of the transition. But these opportunities need to be matched with concrete initiatives to rebuild Syria and restore basic services. We cannot assume that adequate funding will just resume. With diplomatic and economic ties being reestablished, international partners re-evaluating their footprints and postures in Syria, political processes coming into focus, and a continued reduction in conflict, we have a window of opportunity right now that may not last. We need to act decisively to help this transition deliver the better future the people of Syria desperately want. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Masuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Amna Khoulani.
Thank you so much. السيدة الرئيسة.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Amna Khoulani, a human rights defender, survivor from detention, and executive director of Adalati. 6 years ago, I sat in this very council, facing representatives of al-Assad regime, the same regime that arrested my brothers Majd Muhammad and Abdul Sattar and executed them in detention centers, as it did with hundreds of thousands of Syrians, men and women. At that time, I pleaded with the international community to deliver justice to the detainees and their families. I gave voice to a people being systematically slaughtered in plain sight. Today, I return with a different feeling. One only a Syrian would know, a blend of grief and joy, of pain and hope. A feeling that I sensed when I first returned to Damascus after its liberation. I found myself in between mourning those who we lost and finding solace in the thought that their sacrifices were not in vain, just like millions of Syrians. For the first time, I'm able to speak as a human rights defender without fear of arrest or torture in Syria. A new Syria that we return to serve our people, this time from within, creating spaces for civil society to engage closely without fear of being branded traitors, as was the case for decades. None of this would have been possible without the immense sacrifices made by the Syrian people in all their diversity. Today, we have a homeland we fear for, not from, a country that loves us, that we love. This is a moment of pride, of hope, of responsibility. Excellencies, for decades, Syrian women have faced legal, economic, and social injustice. Challenges were far worse during the war through detention, torture, killing, and sexual violence. Yet, despite such profound challenges, Syrian women were at the forefront, leading the fight for justice. We documented violations, provided aid, and tried to lay the foundations for peace. And they should also be central to the transitional phase and part and parcel of Syria's future. Since liberation, women have begun to claim their role in rebuilding Syria. Their presence today in senior government positions marks an important progress. However, it's not enough. A significant gap remains between reality and aspiration. We call for a level of participation that genuinely reflects women's sacrifices and their role in decision-making locally and nationally. A few months ago, I traveled to Syria with a diverse group of women. We went to Dara, Homs, Salamiya, Suwaida, and the monastery of Mar Musa, in addition to other places. The objective was to connect with different communities in Syria and discuss our vision for our beloved country. We encountered a nation weary and communities navigating a process of social and psychological recovery at a delicate moment where hope and fear, determination and caution ebb and flow. Most of the people are optimistic despite pain and challenge. They feel that there are better days coming, but some are wary of what lies ahead. There is a legitimate concern that calls for transparency and respect. We also observed a wide range of views on the transitional period, which is a healthy sign. Despite persistent sectarian and ethnic tensions, some of the hardest legacies of the former regime, Syrians demonstrate a genuine determination to move beyond a painful past with a profound desire for peace and stability. Today, the new Syrian government shoulders a huge responsibility to address this legacy by ensuring that all Syrians from every background to actively participate in shaping the future. We believe that Syria must be built by its people, men and women alike, on the foundations of democracy, citizenship, equality, and respect for human rights without discrimination. Participation should be the principal guide at every stage, from national dialogue to the political process, up until reaching justice and accountability measures. Ladies and gentlemen, transitional justice in Syria is not a political luxury. Instead, it is a national and moral imperative essential for achieving civil peace. Accelerating the effective launch of the justice process is the only true guarantee of genuine and sustainable peace. There can be no peace without justice. No justice, no peace. Recently, two national bodies have been established, the National Commission for Transitional Justice and the National Commission for the Missing. In meetings with both bodies in Damascus, which I attended alongside with activists, survivors, and victims' families, participants strongly emphasized the need for independence of these bodies. There was also broad consensus on the need for consultation with communities across all Syrian cities. There is a need for transparency with victims, survivors, and integrating their vision into the core of the transitional justice process. Participants also emphasized the need for cooperation between these bodies and other international mechanisms and national institutions, including the Independent Institution on Missing Persons and the IIM and others, to develop a clear roadmap and initiate implementation. Thus, the efforts would be inclusive, credible, and consistent with international standards. Madam President, Syria today is undergoing a comprehensive process of reconstruction, not only of its infrastructure, but also of the society and psychological rebuilding. Lifting of sanctions does not signal an end to the need for international support. Quite the contrary. The previous regime left behind a shattered state, bereft of functioning institutions. Syria requires responsible international assistance that fully respects its independence. During my recent visit to Syria, joy swept through the streets following the news of the lifting of sanctions, even though they knew that the effects of the lifting of the sanctions would take time to materialize, months or more. For this reason, the international community, with the support of this Council, must act now to accelerate early recovery efforts. This includes financial and technical support for mine clearance, the removal of war debris, which continue to kill dozens of civilians. We could also start with the restoration of essential services, such as health, education, water, electricity, transport, and telecommunication, among others. We're not seeking ready-made solutions. Rather, we call for the transfer of genuine expertise to assist Syria's emerging institutions in managing this transitional phase effectively. Building robust institutions remains the sole guarantee of lasting stability and the return of Syrian refugees to their homeland. Your Excellencies, to those countries that have stood by the Syrian people through 14 years, those who have welcomed refugees and supported in lifting sanctions, I extend my sincere thanks and gratitude to you. Thank you for standing on the right side of history. As to those who align themselves with the other side, including some present in this chamber, I would tell you it is not too late to join us now and to support people who refuse to accept defeat. Accordingly, I urge the Council to the following. First, encourage and support the Syrian government to guarantee the full, equal, meaningful and safe participation of women from all backgrounds in decision-making, both nationally and locally, aiming for a minimum representation of 30%. Second, promote and support victims and survivors, particularly women, in all transitional justice initiatives, be it formal or informal, recognizing them as rights holders and part and parcel of the peace and stabilization effort. Third, encourage and support the Syrian government to implement effective measures to locate all missing persons and return their remains without discrimination. There should also be technical cooperation with relevant international organizations to share expertise and establish robust mechanisms. Fourth, welcome the lifting of unilateral and multilateral sanctions previously imposed on the Assad regime and call for a thorough review of measures enacted under Security Council Resolution 1267 that may impede Syria's urgent economic recovery. Excellencies, though scarred, Syria stands today free and independent. We possess the will and the capacity to shape our own future. What we need today is not mere support, but a genuine partnership that honors our sacrifices and respects the Syrian-led political transition. As we confront such complex challenges in this transitional phase, we hold fast to hope and work towards a homeland that embraces everyone. We call upon the world to stand with us, not only for Syria, but in affirmation of the fundamental values that bring us together. Thank you. Long live a free Syria and its proud people. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Khoulani for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you to my colleague, Deputy Special Envoy Najat Rochdi. Nice to see you. And Assistant Secretary General Joyce Msuya. Thank you for your briefings. And I'd also like to thank Ms. Amna Khoulani for your longtime bravery and for your compelling remarks today. Thank you for supporting human rights for all Syrians, especially the most vulnerable. And I'd also like to welcome the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. Colleagues, the United States has started a new era in its relationship with Syria. Following President Trump's historic meeting with President Assad, the United States is working towards ceasing U.S. sanctions on Syria. On May 23rd, Secretary of State Rubio waived sanctions under the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act for 180 days, and the U.S. Department of the Treasury issued General License 25, authorizing a broad range of transactions and investments in Syria. We have already begun to see the impact of these actions, most notably in the signing of a $7 billion deal under which the United States, Qatari, and Turkish firms would invest in Syria's power sector. As Ambassador Tom Barak stated after raising the U.S. flag in Damascus, this is just the beginning of the positive impact that the easing of sanctions will have on reconstruction and investment in Syria. The cessation of U.S. sanctions against Syria will give the country a chance to succeed. We encourage other member states to provide similar sanctions relief and to support recovery and reconstruction. President, as we have said, the Syrian government's actions so far on critical files, like the search for missing persons and the destruction of chemical weapons, have given us hope for what Syria can achieve and set expectations for what must come next. First, the government should begin discussions with Israel on a non-aggression agreement and subsequently begin border dispute resolution discussions. Second, the government should, in short order, present its plan and intentions with regard to the foreign fighters on Syrian soil. Third, the government should take necessary steps to ban and deport Palestinian terror groups. Fourth, the government must work with the United States in its continuing or counter ISIS operations. Fifth, the government must provide a plan for how it will assume responsibility for ISIS detention centers in northeast Syria. Countries of origin must also play their part to expeditiously repatriate their nationals from northeast Syria, including those detained in Syrian Democratic Forces facilities and those displaced in Al-Hol and Roj displaced persons camps. Finally, we are encouraged by Syria's cooperation with both the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and the International Atomic Energy Agency, and we look forward to further progress. Colleagues, on the UN's forthcoming strategic assessment for its presence in Syria, this Council should carefully consider the Secretary General's report and work together to determine the appropriate role and presence of the UN in Syria going forward. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we are grateful to Najat Rochdi and Joyce Masuya, as well as Amna Khoulani, for their briefings. Madam President, Israel's military misadventures continue to exacerbate the situation in the entire Middle East. The new wave of tensions in the context of the Iran-Israeli confrontation generate risks not just for Syria, but also its citizens who have for many years borne the burden of the protracted humanitarian and economic crisis. Pulling this country into the quagmire of regional conflict risks escalation of centrifugal trends in the Syrian Arab Republic, which needs to be avoided at all costs. What is inadmissible also is the use of Syrian airspace or territory by third countries. Since the last meeting of the Security Council on Syria, all of the challenges which the country continues to face remain relevant. There has been a significant increase in the risks of resumption of large-scale terrorist activity, including by ISIL affiliate groups. We expect that Damascus will adopt robust counterterrorism measures and will resolve also the situation with foreign terrorist fighters. There's a need for, following the reform of the Syrian security forces, the army and the police of the country to be staffed exclusively with professional staff with untainted track records. This will determine not just trust of the local population vis-a-vis the country, but also will shape the international image of Syria. In this connection, we welcome the release in recent months of hundreds of former army officers owing to the absence of legal justification for their ongoing detention. Such actions on the part of Damascus reflect a genuine focus on intra-Syrian reconciliation and reflect the intention to place the national interests of Syria above the interests of certain groups. We believe that by leveraging the capability and the capacity of hundreds of thousands of fighters who took the oath since before December 2024 will benefit the Syrian state and will help to avoid the tragic errors when many officers of the Saddam period were sidelined and then went on to raise the black flag of ISIL. The matter of Israeli violations of Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity remains on the agenda. We call upon Israel to immediately revert back to stringent compliance with the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement and to withdraw from the buffer zone and the adjacent territories and to cease its shelling at Syria. Israeli actions can hardly be justified with claims about eliminating security threats from Syria, given the fact that Damascus has been continuously broadcasting its intention to peacefully coexist with all of its neighbors, barring none. We believe that any emerging issues can and must be resolved through dialogue. Madam President, there are persistent tensions in the south of the country. At the same time, we note the implementation of the provisional agreement between Damascus and the Druze to provide for security of local law enforcement bodies. Despite sporadic outbreaks of violence in the northeast, the agreement between the central authorities and the Trans-Euphrates continues to be implemented. The situation is exceedingly volatile in Latakia and Tartus provinces, where the levels of instability and security threats remain high. Recent tragic events, as a result of which civilians suffered en masse, these were primarily Alawites. This starkly attests to that. Thousands of families were forced to flee their homes. Some of these families have found temporary refuge in Lebanon, others at the Russian Khmeimim air base, and still others in other Syrian regions. We look forward to the results of the national investigation of the events which took place in the western coast, holding all perpetrators accountable, irrespective of their status and affiliation, will demonstrate, in fact, the focus of the new Syrian authorities and their commitment to rule of law. On the whole, hundreds of thousands of Syrians in neighboring regions remain acutely in need of humanitarian assistance. Once again, we call upon OCHA to pay heightened attention to the situation in Latakia and Tartus. We believe that the new UN humanitarian architecture in Syria needs to take into account the specificities of developments in these regions, and there needs to be provision of the necessary resources for prompt response to crises. Madam President, the data that has been shared today clearly shows that the humanitarian situation in Syria remains exceedingly dire, and it is far from having been resolved. This is exacerbated both by the consequences of the prolonged armed conflict and by the profound socioeconomic crisis, which is being fueled by the practice of the imposition of unilateral sanctions. We view the most recent messages about the partial lifting or easing of this illegitimate restrictive measures by the US, EU, and UK as a step in the right direction. At the same time, we wish to stress the following. These decisions should have taken much earlier for the Syrian people to have been able to exercise their legitimate right to development. Yet another blow to the residents of the country emanates from extreme weather events. According to United Nations assessment, Syria is experiencing its worst drought in decades. Up to 75% of the wheat harvest is under threat. Amid the woeful underfinancing for humanitarian operations, it will be exceedingly difficult for the international community to offset such losses if the wheat harvest in the country is not forthcoming. Moreover, the onset of the summer heat generates risks of communicable diseases spreading. UN agencies need to be ready to tackle these challenges and need to be able to adopt preventive and anticipatory measures for risk reduction. As far as we understand, OCHA has the relevant capabilities, and it can leverage to that end various financial instruments, including the Central Emergency Relief Fund of the United Nations. There's another persistent, serious threat. I refer to that of mine contamination. Mine contamination poses a direct threat to the lives of civilians, impedes humanitarian operations, and complicates the safe return of forcibly dispersed persons. We note with alarm that since December of last year, 400 people have already been victimized by unexploded ordnance. 1/3 of these people are children. The Syrian government and specialized international agencies need to redouble and step up efforts for mine clearance and awareness raising. We highly value the activities of UN humanitarian structures in Syria who are focused on saving people's lives. We believe that under present-day conditions, what is particularly important is food support programs as well as efforts to rebuild the healthcare and water sectors. At the same time, we are very much concerned by the level of financing for the UN humanitarian appeal of the $2 billion requested from January to June 2025. Only approximately 13% has been received. The lack of resources is already generating grave consequences. There's a need right now to consolidate the efforts of donors in the international community. We cannot allow millions of Syrian people to be left without support at such a critical juncture. Madam President, we advocate a political process with the involvement of all ethno-religious groups and minorities in Syria with support from the UN and in accordance with the key provisions of Security Council Resolution 2254. We view this process as the linchpin for the restoration of Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity. As the next steps along this path, we look forward to the formation of a provisional government and the crafting by the Constitutional Committee of a draft basic law. We reaffirm our support for the efforts of the UN Special Envoy, Geir Peterson. We look forward to the inclusive nature of the ongoing international support for inter-Syrian dialogue. Syria and its resilient people have tread their path, surmounting onerous travails with dignity, and despite it all, they preserve their faith in the best and focus on constructive cooperation with the international community. They deserve our concerted support. For our part, we intend to establish fruitful cooperation with Syria and intend to deliver its people and government with the necessary support to surmount the difficulties of the transitional period. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Madam President. And let me also thank Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi and Assistant Secretary General Masuria for their comprehensive briefings. Ms. Khoulani, thank you for your powerful testimony and your description of the mixed feelings of grief and hope that many Syrian people have. Denmark is proud to have stood with the Syrian people throughout these difficult years. Madam President, allow me to make 3 points. First, on the security situation. There can be no meaningful recovery in Syria without genuine safety and protection for all Syrians. Protection of civilians is a cornerstone of international humanitarian law. While we acknowledge the Syrian transitional government's efforts to create a legitimate and united national army, more must be done towards securing the protection of all civilians. Reports of abductions of women, sporadic killings of civilians, and systematic attacks on communities need to be swiftly and credibly addressed. We also worried about the continued threat posed by terrorism in Syria. We strongly condemn attacks by Daesh in Aleppo and other parts of Syria, and we welcome the transitional government's emphasis on combating terrorism. Second, on the humanitarian and economic situation. Denmark is pleased with the European Union's decision to lift sanctions on Syria. This decision is a strong signal of the EU's commitment to support Syria's transition and economic recovery. The newly concluded electricity and power agreements is another step towards progress. It is now essential that these initial gains are continuously built upon and ultimately lead towards a broader, long-term positive economic impact and development for the Syrian people. Funding shortfalls are critical, and millions of Syrians continue to face food and water insecurity. Water scarcity, in particular, remains a serious concern. Denmark has and will continue to work to ensure access to water, including through our project with the ICRC on securing the continued supply of drinking water to more than 12 million people in urban centers across Syria. Third, Madam President, on the political process. We welcome yesterday's announcement by the transitional government on the establishment of the Supreme Committee for the Elections to the People's Assembly. We reiterate the call for an inclusive, transparent and open process, as well as for the full, equal and meaningful participation of representation of women. We take note of the establishment of the Transitional Justice and Missing Persons Commissions. These are important first steps towards a comprehensive and inclusive transitional justice process that represents all the victims. It is important to focus on atrocities committed by all actors across Syria. We reiterate our strong support for Special Envoy Peterson, his team, and all the UN staff working to assist Syria in this critical stage. We repeat the need for a political transition in line with Resolution 2254, a transition which must be led and owned by the Syrian people. Madam President, on the regional level, the situation looks even more challenging now than it did just 1 week ago. We welcome the transitional government's regional engagement, including constructive dialogue between Syria and its neighbors. We reiterate our support for Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity and call on all parties to adhere to the 1974 agreement. We also welcome both Syria's and Israel's calls for an extension of the UNDOF mandate later this month. Denmark stands ready to work with Syria, with this Council, and with the broader international community in support of a peaceful and inclusive transition. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me also begin by thanking Deputy Special Envoy Najat Rochdi and ASG Joyce Masuya for their briefings, and we also thank Madam Khoulani for her important contribution. Pakistan shares long-standing and brotherly ties with the people of Syria. We recognize the immense suffering that they have endured due to years of conflict and foreign intervention. And yet, we are beginning to see glimmers of hope. We believe that a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned political process based on key principles of Security Council Resolution 2254 provides the best way forward. Earlier this month, a Pakistani delegation visited Damascus and met with Foreign Minister Asad al-Shaibani. The visit reaffirmed our commitment to Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, and explored ways to further strengthen our bilateral partnership. We also acknowledge the positive role played by regional and international actors, including Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, the EU, and the United States in supporting Syria's stabilization. We commend the continued efforts of the Special Envoy to foster inclusive dialogue. And President, allow me to briefly highlight 5 key points here. First, we welcome recent steps on the political front, especially the formation of the Supreme Committee for Elections. As the Special Envoy also noted, this could be an important step toward broader constitutional and institutional progress. Second, the humanitarian situation remains dire. Over 16 million people require assistance, with more than 14 million facing food insecurity. We must ensure that humanitarian aid remains timely, predictable, and unimpeded. Third, the recent easing of sanctions, including the US General License 25, and steps taken by the EU and the United Kingdom, is a welcome development. These measures can help unlock humanitarian access and support early recovery and self-reliance. Fourth, the threat of terrorism persists. Groups like ISIL and foreign terrorist fighters continue to operate within Syria, posing threats to both national and regional security. We must not, therefore, lose focus on this front. Fifth, we are deeply concerned about the regional impact of Israeli military actions in Syria. These attacks violate Syria's sovereignty and breach international law, including Security Council Resolutions 350 and 497. They risk undermining the fragile gains made on the ground. We call for full compliance with the 1974 disengagement agreement and reiterate the need to uphold Syria's sovereignty without exception. Madam President, Syria stands at a delicate yet hopeful juncture. Our collective responsibility is to sustain this momentum by continuing humanitarian assistance, by promoting inclusive governance, and by upholding Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. Pakistan will remain a steadfast partner of the Syrian people. Madam President, in conclusion, I would like to add that in the regional context, we are gravely concerned by the continued Israeli military aggression in Gaza, strikes in Syria, and the latest ongoing aggression against Iran, which carry serious implications for regional peace and security. These actions have increased instability, exacerbated humanitarian suffering, and risk spiraling wider conflict. Such conduct is in clear violation of international law and UN Charter. This needs to end. The Security Council must fulfill its responsibility in that regard by calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities and urgent steps to de-escalate the situation across the region and promote dialogue and diplomacy to ensure long-term peace and stability in the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd also like to thank Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi and ASG Umsuya for their briefings. I also thank Ms. Khoulani for sharing her experience and insights. Despite growing international engagement and the recent easing of sanctions, high hopes for progress in Syria are being dampened by the shadow of regional escalation, continued violence on the ground, and the little meaningful advances on transitional justice. Let me make the following points in this regard. First, all hostilities violating Syria's territorial sovereignty must stop. We are concerned by Israel's intensifying incursions into Syria following the alleged missile attack earlier this month. The circumstances leading up to this incident should be investigated, and those responsible must be held accountable. In any case, as many Council members, including us, have consistently emphasized, Israel's security concerns must be addressed in a manner that respects international law. Second, countering Daesh and violent extremism must remain an urgent priority. Indeed, it is seriously concerning that these terrorists have resumed their attacks since early this month, precisely at a time when Damascus is restructuring its national security institutions and the counterterrorism forces are undergoing realignment. We note the decision to incorporate some foreign insurgents with track record of violent extremism into Syria's national security framework. While preventing Daesh from reconstituting must be the priority, we must be vigilant that this decision also carries risk. We therefore urge Damascus to implement robust vetting and rehabilitation measures to prevent extremist ideologies from taking root within the nascent institutions meant to provide security for all Syrians. Third, we welcome Syria's continued cooperation with international bodies to ensure compliance with global norms on non-proliferation. We are particularly encouraged by its cooperation with the IAEA, including the recent visit by the IAEA Director General and his team to Damascus, and their unhindered access to sites relevant to clarifying Syria's past nuclear activities. We also commend the advancement in cooperation between Syria and OPCW, including progress made in securing OPCW permanent presence in Damascus. We hope that this opportunity will lead to the complete destruction of chemical weapons in Syria. Fourth, Syria's pursuit of transitional justice must be a key part of any inclusive political process. Ongoing extrajudicial killings and punishments, albeit sporadic, once again underscore that lasting social cohesion and stability is only attainable when there is a shared understanding of how transitional justice will be realized. We therefore call on Damascus to articulate and announce its plan for achieving transitional justice in a transparent and inclusive manner. Engagement with the UN will be critical in this regard, as its technical expertise is essential to ensuring the political process is consistent with the principles of Resolution 2254. Fifth, we call for the international community to pay greater attention to the continuing humanitarian crisis of the country. Setting Syria back on a path to stability now risks stalling in the face of worsening humanitarian conditions, including the most severe drought in decades, compounded by an acute funding crisis. We hope the international community will step up its support, building on international efforts already underway, including our contribution of $35 million this year. In closing, Madam President, the grave ongoing Israel-Iran conflict is not only overshadowing the positive developments in Syria, but also exacerbating the serious challenges that Damascus currently faces in its incipient phase of nation building. This new and unfortunate development must not erode the historic momentum Syria has gained after 14 years of devastation and agony. De-escalation is essential, and we reiterate our call for maximum restraint by all parties concerned. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President, and let me also thank Deputy Special Envoy Mrs. Rochdi, ASG Misuya, as well as Mrs. Khoulani for the valuable briefings today. Madam President, the recent outbreaks of hostilities in the Middle East is a testament to how fragile the region's stability is. Against this background, a unified, stable and fully representative Syria, whose sovereignty and territorial integrity is respected by all, should remain our common goal. Greece, as a member of this Council, and in line with its consistent stance towards Syria since the fall of the Assad regime, supports Syria's inclusive political transition as the essential goal for so many Syrians in the country and abroad. As challenges remain, I wish to highlight 4 following points today. First, a fully inclusive political transition in line with the principles of Security Council Resolution 2254 is necessary for the security and stability of the country. Without the political integration of all the components of the Syrian society, recovery efforts will remain fragmented and vulnerable. All Syrians deserve to live without fear. This includes Christians, Alawites, Kurdish Syrians and Druze, without ever forgetting women. All Syrians deserve to see themselves represented in the government and institutions. In this vein, we expect the national dialogue to continue and for the future constitution to echo the voices of the whole of the Syrian society and diaspora. In the northeast, the March agreement between the SDF, a critical ally in the international fight against terrorists, and Damascus must be carefully implemented by both sides, and we encourage them to address pending issues in a spirit of compromise. As we urge the transitional government to ensure that armed groups in the north of Syria do not disrupt the process, so do we urge regional actors to refrain from violence or inciting escalation. Second, Syria's successful integration in the international community is contingent on its respect for international law. For Syria to find its footing and recover, it is imperative that it fully adheres to the global rules. This involves founding its relations with other states on the basis of international law, including the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which constitutes customary international law. Syria has to demonstrate that they respect the sovereign rights of neighboring countries, both on land and at sea. Third, Greece will assist in alleviating the humanitarian situation in the country and will contribute effectively to its reconstruction and economic reconstitution. Fully aware of this, Greece pledged its tangible support for Syria's recovery at the recent 9th Brussels conference in March and is ready to contribute more with any means necessary. In this spirit, the EU was swift in lifting sanctions as part of a gradual, conditional and reversible approach to support Syria. We shall continue ever vigilant to closely monitor developments on the basis of concrete progress on accountability, inclusivity of the political process, as well as continued respect for international law. Against this background, we welcome the progress made with international financial institutions, as well as the interests of international development actors and NGOs, following major sanction lifting announcements. More good news is expected to come, as long as the Syrian authorities stay in course. Fourth, ensuring accountability and promoting transitional justice is critical against the background of a precarious security situation. We welcome last week's informal GA briefing by Mrs. Quintana, head of the IIMP, confirming that the traditional authorities are cooperating with the institution. Equally, we welcome the establishment of the 2 Syrian national authorities for missing persons and traditional justice, which we expect to function with transparency, impartiality and inclusiveness. The abhorrent violence last March targeted mostly Alawites but also Christian, and the violent incidents against the Druze community in May are stark reminders of the risks and challenges that remains in this context. It is indeed crucial that the transitional authorities maintain order, ensure control over armed groups, protect all Syrians regardless of the background, and hold all perpetrators accountable without delay in line with international law, norms and standards. Greece calls for a swift, transparent, credible and impartial investigation by an investigative committee and for the relevant UN mechanism to be also allowed to investigate these crimes. Last but not least, the security landscape poses several challenges. A sustainable solution to the issue of foreign fighters and the integration of all armed groups into national security forces is a prerequisite for internal security and political stability. Ensuring that all terrorist and violent extremist elements are excluded as part of the wider and robust security sector reform effort is essential. Madam President, in closing, let me stress that Syria has an historic opportunity to achieve progress and prosperity by becoming a factor of stability for the wider region and an example of successful reconstruction after years of devastation and tyranny. Historically tied with the Syrian people, Greece wholeheartedly supports this vision, to which the UN system is of paramount importance. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the members of the A3+, namely Guyana, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and my own country, Algeria. At the outset, the A3+ extends its sincere appreciation to Deputy Special Envoy Najat Rochdi and ASG Joyce Msuya for their briefings. We have also taken careful note of the contribution of Ms. Amna Khoulani. Madam President, the Syrian people's resilience, courage, and aspiration for peace and dignity deserve our full and steadfast support. Despite a delicate semblance of stability, the situation in Syria remains deeply fragile. Stability in Syria is not only essential for its own people, but it is also a cornerstone for the security and prosperity of the entire region. Yes, the future of Syria is intrinsically tied to the ability of its people to coexist peacefully, as they have done for centuries, and to overcome the grievances of history through dialogue, through reconciliation, and mutual respect. Madam President, a durable peace in Syria can only be achieved through a genuine, inclusive, Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process in accordance with the principles outlined in Security Council Resolution 2254. The A3+ expresses its full support for the United Nations and for the Special Envoy of the Secretary General in their critical efforts to facilitate this process. We believe that transitional justice, national reconciliation, the clarification of the fate of missing persons, and inclusive dialogue are fundamental to healing the wounds of the Syrian people and building the foundation for a just political transition in Syria. The resilience of the Syrian people is undeniable. However, the unwavering support of the international community remains indispensable at this critical juncture. We emphasize that cooperation must prevail over confrontation and collaboration over antagonism. The path forward in Syria is in unity, not division. And the A3+ reaffirms its unwavering support for the sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. Madam President, the A3+ strongly condemn the repeated Israeli incursion in Syrian territory and the violations of the disengagement of forces agreement. UNDOF has reported that the Israeli Defense Forces carried out several strikes in the area of limitation on the Bravo side, and has observed the continued construction of counter-mobility obstacles by the IDF along the ceasefire line. These actions not only breach Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but also threaten regional stability. We call for the immediate cessation of such violation and reiterate our demands for full compliance with the 94 disengagement agreement. Furthermore, we reaffirm that the occupied Syrian Golan remains Syrian territory under international law, as clearly established in Security Council Resolution 497. Madam President, we are gravely concerned by UN reports of a resurgence of Daesh activity in parts of Syria. The A3+ has consistently warned against the threat of terrorism and reiterate the urgent need for coordinated international action to decisively and comprehensively combat terrorist groups and address the root causes of radicalization. The return of instability would be a tragedy for the Syrian people, who have already endured too much. Madam President, the humanitarian situation in Syria is catastrophic. Funding shortfalls, with only 14% of the required resources received for the humanitarian response plan, combined with the worst drought-like condition in decades, are deepening the crisis. As the return of refugees is expected to increase over this summer, food and water and security will worsen. Today, as stated by Ms. Msuya, only 2.5 million out of the 8 million people targeted are reached monthly by humanitarian efforts. This is simply unsustainable and unacceptable. We call on donors to honor their pledges. This is not only a matter of principle, but of shared responsibility and international solidarity. The global community must urgently mobilize the necessary resources to report humanitarian relief and ensure a smooth transition from emergency assistance to sustainable development in Syria. This is the only viable path toward Syria's economic recovery and long-term stability. While the lifting of unilateral sanctions is a welcome step, it's not sufficient. All efforts must converge to support Syria's reintegration into the global economy, paving the way for inclusive growth and prosperity. We also underscore the importance of early recovery programming, especially in sectors such as health, education, agriculture, infrastructure, and electricity, which are vital for restoring basic services and enabling the return of millions displaced persons. Madam President, in conclusion, Guyana, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and Algeria renew its steadfast support to the people of Syria. Their quest for peace, for dignity, and recovery must be met with equal determination by the international community. The time has come to support Syria not only with words, but with meaningful actions for peace, for justice, and the future of hope in the entire region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. I thank Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi and ASD Misuya for their briefings. I listened carefully to the statement by civil society representative Ms. Khoulani. I welcome the presence of the representatives of Syria, Iran, Yemen, and Turkey at today's meeting. Syria is at a critical juncture in achieving political stability and economic recovery. Despite the recent active efforts by the Syrian parties, including those to promote internal reconciliation, the domestic situation remains complex and fragile. We hope that the Syrian interim authorities will take effective measures to deliver on their commitments and earnestly respond to and address the concerns of the international community, restore peace and stability with the help of the international community, so that the Syrian people can live in stability and dignity at an earlier date. A broad and inclusive political transition should be promoted. The holding of the National Dialogue Conference is a major step towards political transition. The Syrian interim authorities should respond actively to the voices of all sectors by continuing to promote extensive dialogue and consultation, strengthen internal unity, and achieve genuine inclusiveness. In this regard, the principles set out in Security Council Resolution 2254 can provide important guidance and should continue to be upheld. The investigation into the violent incidents on the Western Coast is to be concluded in July. We expect the investigation to move forward in a transparent and responsible manner so as to reach conclusions that can withstand scrutiny. China commends the efforts of Special Envoy Patterson to communicate with Syrian parties and supports the continued important role by the United Nations in the Syrian political transition process. Efforts should be made to resolutely combat all terrorist forces in Syria. Recently, multiple violent terrorist incidents have occurred in Syria, heightening the risk of the expansion and resurgence of terrorist organizations and extremist forces by taking advantage of the situation, which is a cause for concern. It is reported that some FTFs in Syria have recently been integrated into Syrian government forces. China is gravely concerned about the development. The Syrian interim authorities should earnestly fulfill their counterterrorism obligations and immediately take all necessary measures to combat all terrorist organizations listed by the Security Council, including the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement, also known as Turkestan Islamic Party. The counterterrorism-related resolutions of the Security Council must be implemented and the seriousness of relevant sanctions regime upheld. Utmost efforts should be made to effectively alleviate the humanitarian situation. For some time now, despite multiple challenges, including funding shortfall, the UN humanitarian agencies have been working hard to conduct humanitarian operations in various parts of Syria. The international community, especially traditional donors, should step up their assistance and make greater efforts to alleviate the humanitarian crisis. We take note of the agreement reached by the Syrian interim authorities with relevant parties on the evacuation from El Hol refugee camp and support the participation of UN agencies in the relevant work. The evacuation of refugees should be conducted on a voluntary basis and in a safe and orderly manner. President, China is deeply concerned about Israel's attacks on Iran, which caused the spike of military conflicts. We condemn Israel's violation of Iran's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity. If the conflict between Israel and Iran continues to escalate or even spill over, Syria and other countries in the Middle East will inevitably bear the brunt. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has spoken with his Iranian and Israeli counterparts, calling on both sides to resolve differences through dialogue. China stands ready to maintain communication with relevant parties and to play a constructive role in promoting an early de-escalation of the situation. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I start by thanking Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi, Assistant Secretary General Moussouya, and Ms. Khoulani for your informative and insightful briefings. President, I'll make 3 points today. First, this remains a pivotal but fragile moment for Syria as it seeks a more stable and prosperous future. And a peaceful and secure Syria is in the interests of all Syrians and the wider region. There is a clear risk, as others have highlighted this morning, that the current crisis in the Middle East escalates with serious implications for security across the region and beyond, including in Syria. We encourage all actors to avoid any activity that will further destabilize the region at this precarious moment. Second, June marks 6 months since the fall of the brutal Assad regime. We welcome the positive steps the Syrian government has taken so far in advancing a peaceful political transition. This includes diverse cabinet appointments and internal agreements, including with the Syrian Democratic Forces. We look forward to progress on implementation. We welcome the formation in recent days of the Supreme Electoral Committee for the People's Assembly elections. This is an important step in building legislative and electoral processes that serve the Syrian people and keeping up momentum on the transition process. We urge those involved in the process to prioritize inclusivity and representation in the appointment and election of People's Assembly members. Finally, we note progress on accountability efforts in Syria that pursue justice for victims and survivors, and initiatives for seeking truth for the families of those still awaiting answers. We encourage the newly formed National Commissions on Transitional Justice and Missing Persons to work in close partnership with Syrian civil society and the United Nations. As Ms. Khoulani emphasized so eloquently, it is key that their efforts are transparent and shaped by the experiences of survivors and families. We encourage the Syrian government to continue to engage positively with UN mechanisms, including the Commission of Inquiry, the Independent Institution on Missing Persons, and the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, and use their expertise effectively as they lay out the next steps for their own accountability agenda in Syria. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Panama.
Gracias. Thank you, Madam President. We thank the Deputy Special Envoy, Najat Rochdi, and the ASG for Humanitarian Affairs, Ms. Joyce Moussouya, for their briefings. And we also thank Amna Khoulani, Executive Director of the Adalati Center, for her valuable information. We also welcome with us in the room the delegations of the Syrian Arab Republic, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Yemen, and Turkey. Panama continues to watch closely developments in the Syrian Arab Republic acknowledging that the country is at a critical juncture. Our country has reiterated the importance for the Syrian political process to be inclusive and Syrian-led. It must respect the ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity of the country and be guided by the spirit of Resolution 2254 with the support of the United Nations. We welcome recent steps towards a political transition, such as the recent issuance of the decree allowing for the establishment of the Supreme Committee for the People's Assembly elections. This important step must also consider integration and transparency, and in particular, measures allowing for the participation and effective representation of women in this process as a basis for political consensus and appropriate political consensus. In that regard, we welcome the recent meeting of the Women's Advisory Board in Damascus, and we see it as a step forward in including historically marginalized voices. We also underscore the establishment of a National Commission for Transitional Justice and a National Commission for Missing Persons. Panama would highlight the consolidation of coordination efforts on the ground through the establishment of a humanitarian country team in Damascus. This is a tangible step towards more cohesive and efficient response, which will strengthen institutional presence in the country and facilitate greater interaction with local stakeholders. However, we are particularly concerned about the humanitarian situation. Extreme weather conditions, which today are hitting Syria, have led to the worst drought in decades, with historic levels of water shortages and rainfall far below normal levels. These events are seriously impacting agricultural production, endangering food security, and worsening pressure on basic water resources. This leads to a threat of a resurgence of outbreaks of cholera with the arrival of warm weather, and therefore Panama would call for redoubled efforts towards cooperation, particularly given the alarming shortfall in financing which threatens the continuity of vital programs in the area of healthcare, food, and water. We take note of the recent visit by an IMF team. This is a positive sign for openness and commitment to economic recovery. At the same time, we reiterate the need for recent initiatives aimed at easing sanctions against Syria to continue constructively and for them to become strong and verifiable commitments in matters of governance. This will lead to an improvement in the daily lives of the civilian population. Similarly, we call for guarantees of protection for all communities, in particular those which have been victims of sectarian violence. Combating terrorism must remain a priority. This requires prevention strategies, which includes institution building and community reintegration, preventing extremist positions from permeating Syrian politics. We reiterate the importance for investigations into violent events to be independent, transparent, and accessible to the international community. Madam President, today more than ever, Syria has a genuine opportunity to become a beacon of hope in a region profoundly impacted by the conflict and by instability. Panama urges the Syrian interim authorities to redouble their efforts and work towards comprehensive recovery in their country, not just for their own people, but also with an aim to, with a view to contributing to international peace and security. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of France.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I wish to first and foremost thank Madam Najat Rochdi, Deputy Special Envoy of the Secretary General, as well as Madam Joyce Masuya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, for their briefings on the situation in Syria. And I also wish to thank Madam Amina Khoulani, in particular, Human Rights Defender, Executive Director of Dalati Center, for her testimony, which reflects the importance of transitional justice. Madam President, the Middle East has entered a new phase of tensions. We have an obligation to act to prevent the situation from affecting the transition in Syria, to provide the country with an opportunity to become a hub of regional stability. To that end, the international community has a responsibility to assist Syria in 3 areas. Firstly, to address the humanitarian urgent situation and to support political and economic reintegration of Syria within the international community. For the reasons already mentioned, the humanitarian reasons and rebuilding basic services are priorities. The international community needs to deliver assistance to that end and to contribute financing. France has contributed to these initiatives and we will continue our financial support. This effort is indispensable for the population and the country's recovery. For our part, in February 2025, the European Union has opted to end economic sanctions, which weighed upon Syria. This is now has been in effect. Syria needs to be able to rebuild a functional economy to deliver decent living conditions to the Syrian people with support from all states. We support the mobilization of bilateral, international, and regional donors, as well as those from the private sector. The reintegration of Syria within the international community hinges on regional normalization. We encourage the Syrian authorities to continue their efforts to rebuild constructive relations with their neighbors, as is the case with Lebanon. We call upon Israel to play its part and to seize the historic opportunity, as represented by a Syria which wishes to make peace in relations with its neighbors. Israel needs to end its military operations on Syrian soil and to withdraw from the separation zone that has been established, that was established in the 1974 disengagement agreement. Syria and Israel must be mindful of the security concerns of each. Second area of action, supporting the restoration of civil peace and unity of Syria. The fall of a dictatorship and restoration of civil peace generates tremendous hope. Nevertheless, the massacres in early March and the ongoing sectarian violence, which has been the case since then, demonstrates the fact that the path ahead is long. We hope that the Commission of Inquiry, which has been tasked with establishing accountability for crimes perpetrated in the coastal region, that this commission will generate clear and impartial conclusions. We trust that the Syrian authorities will do everything possible for Syrian people to be respected without a spirit of vengeance or sectarianism, in a spirit of unity in diversity. We also anticipate that the commitments vis-à-vis the Kurds will be honored. These provide an opportunity to preserve Syrian unity and territorial integrity. Civil peace hinges on national reconciliation and accountability. The transitional justice process needs to be demanding and it needs to be inclusive. Madam Khoulani was clear on that point. The first step in that direction is, and we welcome Damascus' establishment of a national authority for missing persons and a national authority for transitional justice has been established in Syria. In parallel, we encourage the Syrian authorities to continue to cooperate with the relevant UN bodies in order to benefit from their expertise and their resources. Third area of action, to help the Syrian authorities make the political transition a collective success. A stable Syria means that the terrorist threat is eradicated. The Syrian authorities need to continue this struggle to resolve the issue of foreign terrorist fighters. The international community, in addition, is contributing to the dismantling of this chemical program, and Damascus' cooperation with the relevant body is necessary. The Syrian authorities have committed to building inclusive bodies to reflect the needs of all the Syrian people to ensure the success of this transition period. France stands ready to support administrative capacity building of the Syrian state. We also applaud the efforts of the United Nations, particularly those of Gary Peterson, in delivering valuable support and guiding the Syrian authorities towards the establishment of an inclusive Syria in the spirit established under the principles of the Resolution 2254. We eagerly await the outcomes of the strategic review to ensure the smooth organization of United Nations support for the new Syria. The Security Council needs to stand ready to draw the operational conclusions therefrom. Madam President, the challenge for our council is to provide the best possible support within the deteriorated regional environment, support Syrian efforts to overcome the past, to build a Syria unified in its diversity, in peace with neighbors, free of tyranny and terrorism. France stands ready to contribute. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi, ASG Msuya, and Ms. Khoulani for their briefings. Madam President, in our recent interventions in this chamber, we emphasized the historic opportunity Syria has for a change. In this regard, we welcome the interim authorities' initial commitments, including stronger engagement with the international community and the UN. This, together with the last month's announcement by several states as well as the EU on the lifting of certain sanctions, present a real opportunity that should not be missed. Today, Madam President, I wish to make the following points. Firstly, since last December, the international community, regional organizations, and the UN have expressed readiness to assist and support Syrian people in rebuilding their country. Economic recovery and development will be a crucial part of these efforts. Alongside continued international support, we encourage the interim authorities to prioritize comprehensive economic reform and strengthen governance standards. Secondly, economic recovery, however, is not sufficient. It must be complemented by an inclusive and peaceful political transition in line with the principles of the Security Council Resolution 2254. A vital next step will be the prompt formation of a provisional legislative council which should begin work on an urgent legislative reform agenda. This will be an essential part of rebuilding Syria's political consensus, restoring state institutions, and establishing the necessary framework for the economy, justice, democratic governance, and political participation. Equally essential will be the work of the committee drafting a new constitution. It is crucial that the future constitutional process fully reflects the rich and diverse fabric of Syrian society by including all social and political components. While we recognize that these are monumental tasks, they are necessary. To address the growing polarization, to counter hate speech, and foster mutual understanding among the different communities, media freedom is indispensable. Likewise, genuine transition justice must be established so that perpetrators of atrocities are held accountable. The UN can offer invaluable assistance in that regard. Thirdly, we continue to call for an immediate end to violence and the protection of civilians throughout Syria. Reports of ongoing sectarian violence and renewed regrouping and attacks by Daesh are deeply alarming, as they threaten not only Syria's stability, but also that of a wider region. We reiterate our urgent appeal to the interim authorities to ensure that Syria does not become a breeding ground or safe haven for terrorism, and to others to fully respect the independence, unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Syria. Lastly, the immense humanitarian needs in Syria persist, and everything possible needs to be done so that humanitarian aid reaches all Syrians in need throughout unimpeded and safe access. We call on new and existing donors to step up to address our humanitarian responsibility. Slovenia has committed additional funding in support of the ICRC's work in Syria. We also note that protection risks continue with unexploded remnants of war, causing physical harm, including to children, on a daily basis in some eastern governorates. These conditions continue to undermine the possibility of safe returns of Syrians to their homes. It will need to be addressed as soon as possible. Madam President, I began my statement by mentioning a historic opportunity for Syria to finally build a country that every Syrian will be able to call home, where they will be free, where their children will be able to go to school, and where bombs and death will be but a distant memory. Slovenia remains committed to that goal. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to thank Madam Najat Rochdi, Deputy Special Envoy of the Secretary General, and Mrs. Joyce Msoya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, for their briefing. I would also like to welcome Ms. Amna Khoulani from the civil society and thank her for her valuable briefing. Madam President, despite the turbulent and tense situation in the region and the grave challenges it poses, the Syrian government continues to work to turn the page of pain and suffering. It is moving steadily with trust to establish a new phase characterized by peace, stability, openness, and building partnerships. This is exemplified in the political mobilization, this active Syrian political mobilization with various countries over the world, in addition to the constructive diplomacy and positive multifaceted engagement, including in the economic, commercial, and security fields at the regional and international levels. This established bonds of friendship and cooperation based on common interests and mutual respect. These efforts have been accompanied by serious and concrete steps in cooperation with the United Nations, its agencies and mechanisms, as well as with relevant international organizations, including other relevant international organizations like the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, as I explained in the statement I made on behalf of my government before your esteemed Council on the 5th of January. This is also the case in the field of combating terrorism and addressing drug trafficking and smuggling. This should reassure partners and resolve outstanding issues to turn that page. Madam President, in parallel with its efforts at the international level, the Syrian government continues its endeavors domestically. After issuing 2 presidential decrees to form the National Commission for Missing Persons and the National Commission for Transitional Justice, and in line with the current ongoing practical efforts in those 2 important phases, the President of the Republic issued a few days ago Decree number 66. The decree aims to activate the legislative authority and complete state institutions by forming the Higher Committee for People's Assembly elections as stipulated in the Constitutional Declaration, naming its chair and members. This commission will oversee the formation of electoral subsidiary bodies to elect 2/3 of the 150 members of the People's Assembly. Meanwhile, the President of the Republic will appoint the remaining members to ensure fair representation and competence. Practical steps have also been taken to promote civil peace and the rule of law, while preventing any individual acts or reprisals that could destabilize the community. The Ministry of Interior has embarked on a comprehensive restructuring of its agencies and institutions to ensure the security of Syrians. All the same, the Ministry of Defense continues to work on establishing a national army. Calls were issued by official and civil bodies emphasizing the criminalization and prohibition of extrajudicial killings. They support the transitional justice process as well as national reconciliation, in a way that ensures accountability for perpetrators of grave violations, guarantee justice and reparations for victims. All this comes within the framework of an institutional approach that enables society to heal its wounds, overcome its pain, and move towards a new Syria. A Syria that is built by the effort of all its people for all its people, women and men, including the young people. A single, unifying Syria, proud of its heritage and its religious, ethnic, and cultural diversity. Madam President, in a related context, efforts continue to address the accumulated humanitarian and development challenges to improve living conditions and provide services to Syrians. The Rukban camp was dismantled, ending the suffering of its remaining residents. This facilitates the return to their cities and villages. Practical steps were initiated to address the unsustainable conditions in El Haul camp and other camps in northeastern Syria. Nearly 1.5 million Syrian refugees and internally displaced persons have returned to their homes. Strengthening these achievements requires tangible international support for our efforts to provide services, rehabilitate infrastructure, remove debris, ensure reconstruction, and ensure economic recovery and monetary stability, in addition to mine clearance and removing explosive remnants that have claimed the lives of hundreds of people since last December. We look forward to increased humanitarian and development funding and the fulfillment of relevant international pledges. Funding the humanitarian response plan did not exceed 13% up till now, and we're already in the middle of the year, at a time when Syria is facing a significant decline in agricultural crops for this current season due to the drought and other climate factors. This affected livelihoods in many rural areas and increased rates of food insecurity. Today, Syria does not seek emergency relief aid, despite its importance. Instead, Syria looks forward to real partnerships based on common interests and a win-win equation. This would ensure a qualitative leap forward for Syrians as soon as possible, whether in water, energy, agriculture, education, health care, or other essential areas. Some of the investment deals and projects that have been signed recently show that the road to investment in Syria is now open and safe. The Syrian government is close to finalizing a new draft investment law that will be enacted soon. It is high time for Syrians to rejoice, to build a homeland, to create a future worthy of them and their sacrifices, and we must support them and support this hope for a better tomorrow. It would be a remiss not to thank the Trump administration, the United Kingdom, France, the European Union member states and Japan for lifting the sanctions that Syrians have suffered from for too long. We also express our thanks and appreciation to the brotherly and friendly countries that have led high-level diplomatic efforts to achieve this aim. Foremost, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, the UAE, and Jordan, as well as the member states in this council and beyond that have called time and again for the lifting of these sanctions. We look forward to the completion of this process and ensure the complete and final lifting of all sanctions and measures that continue to have negative impact on various aspects of our joint cooperation. Madam President, Israel's repeated attacks on Syria remain a stumbling block to our stability effort. Israel continues its destructive policies and acts of aggression by seeking to strengthen its illegal presence on Syrian territory. They are building military installations and launching numerous attacks. The last of such attacks was in the town of Beit Jin in rural Damascus at dawn last Thursday, which led to the death of a young man and the abduction of others. On the same day, last Thursday, your august council heard a briefing from the Department of Political Affairs and Peace Building on Israeli practices and the systematic violations committed by the occupation forces against the people of the areas in which they have infiltrated. Such acts are a flagrant violation of the UN Charter, Security Council resolutions, and the 1974 Disengagement Agreement. My country, Syria, emphasizes the need to stop Israel's aggressive practices and to put an end to the Israeli occupation of the Syrian Golan and the territories into which the occupation forces have penetrated since the 8th of December of last year. Syria supports the extension of the UNDOF's mandate and emphasizes the need to empower the force to fulfill its mandate. To conclude, Madam President, Syrians, with their human capital, scientific and professional competencies, and history of civilization, are capable of rebuilding their homeland and creating the desired future. Over the past years, we have witnessed the successes and excellence of Syrians in the countries that have hosted them. Today, Syria is writing a new success story as it looks forward to the United Nations and its member states to be part of that success story in a manner consistent with preserving Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. We are counting on a UN role that would be effective and commensurate with the current stage, a role that supports our national effort as a partner in the path towards reconstruction and development to achieve welfare and prosperity. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
In the name of God, the Compassionate and Merciful, thank you, Madam President. We appreciate Ms. Rochdi, Deputy Special Envoy, and Ms. Misriya, Assistant Secretary General, for their insightful briefing. We listened carefully to the statement delivered by Ms. Khoulani. Madam President, I wish to make the following points on the situation in Syrian Arab Republic while also drawing the Council's attention to Israeli relentless terrorist and barbaric attack against the Islamic Republic of Iran. First, the Islamic Republic of Iran reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. For over a decade, the Syrian people have endured immense suffering under foreign occupation, terrorism, and coercive measures. This time has come for the people of Syria to determine the future of their country free from external interference and to live in dignity, stability without condition or constraint. Second, today, over 16 million Syrians require urgent humanitarian assistance. The suffering of civilians must never be politicized. We welcome the recent step toward economic recovery, including the partial suspension of sanctions and the renewed engagement of the World Bank and IMF. However, we stress that any easing of sanctions must translate into real improvement on the ground. All unilateral sanctions, unjust, illegal, and contrary to the UN Charter, must be fully and unconditionally lifted. Third, practical engagement and cooperation between the UN and the interim authorities are essential to advancing an inclusive political process in line with Resolution 2254. In this regard, we welcome the visit of a special envoy to Syria in 19 May and his constructive engagement with Syrian officials. Fourth, the 10th March agreement between the interim government and the Syrian Democratic Forces presents an opportunity for reconciliation and unity. We welcome follow-up meeting, prisoner exchange, and progress on education and return from the Al-Hol camp. Nonetheless, the security situation remains fragile. We express deep concern over renewed violence in Deir ez-Zor, Homs, and Sueda, including ISIL-related attacks. We note with encouragement the growing return of refugees and IDPs and closure of Rukban camp. Fifth, a just and lasting peace in Syria requires sustained political engagement, inclusive dialogue, and economic recovery. Syria has every right and duty as a sovereign state to restore peace and authority throughout its territory. Yet this right is impeded by ongoing foreign military presence and occupation, particularly in the northeast and south. Sixth, we strongly condemn continued Israeli military aggression in the occupied Golan, which violate the UN Charter, all the relevant Security Council resolutions, and gravely threaten the regional peace and stability. We urge the Council not to remain silent in the face of the repeated Israeli aggression, which represent the systematic violation of international law. These acts are not isolated. They are part of the broader pattern of unlawful use of force, now extending to continued attacks against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Having said that, I wish to make a few remarks regarding the ongoing barbaric attack and act of aggression by the terrorist and child-killing regime of Israel against my country. First, as we have already conveyed in this chamber and our formal communication to you, Madam President, and to the Secretary General, Israel has committed a blatant and provoked act of aggression against Iran's sovereignty and territorial integrity in grave violation of United Nations Charter and international law. These ongoing terrorist attacks deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure and peaceful nuclear facilities under the full IAEA safeguard, posing a serious risk of catastrophic consequences. Israel launched indiscriminate strikes against densely populated cities. Hospitals, homes, and essential infrastructure were destroyed. There are clear and undeniable war crimes. Second, in response, Iran exercised its inherent right to self-defense in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter to protect its people and vital national interests. Our response was defensive, limited, and proportionate, targeting only military and economic assets directly involved in the aggression. Iran does not seek escalation, but we will not hesitate to defend our people's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Third, let me be clear, Iran did not start this war. Israel launched this aggression, emboldened by a green light from the United States. Israeli claim of preemptive self-defense is legally unfounded and, if normalized, would seriously undermine one of the most fundamental principles of the Charter, the prohibition of the use of force. As such, the false narrative of an existential threat as invoked by Israeli and supported by some Western countries is nothing more than a cover-up to justify aggression and obscure Israeli atrocities. Once again, we are witnessing the dangerous reversal of roles where the aggressor is shielded and the victims is blamed. The same shameful pattern that the world has seen unfold in Gaza is now being repeated. This double standard is a moral and legal failure, one that will tarnish the records of those Western countries, especially the US, UK, and France, who have attempted to justify this flagrant violation. Their cynical position are undermining the credibility of this Council and very principles of UN Charter. Fourth, the only country capable of stopping Israeli crimes and aggression is the United States. If the US acts in good faith and is truly committed to diplomacy, as it claims, it can compel Israel to stop its aggression. But instead, and regrettably, we heard President Trump last night echoing with Netanyahu calling for evacuation of Tehran. Such a threat is not only irresponsible, but it is also reflect the deliberate policy of supporting targeting civilians. Fifth, let us speak frankly. Neither this Security Council nor any other relevant UN body has thus far demonstrated the capacity to stop the aggressor. The painful experiences of Israeli crimes in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen have shown that the Security Council has consistently failed in its most basic duty to determine the aggressor and uphold international peace and security. We once again urge this Council to fulfill this mandate, condemn Israeli unlawful use of force, and explicitly reject its claims of preemptive self-defense as contrary to the Charter and international law, and stop the rogue regime from further aggression. Finally, Iran will continue to act under international law, but unless the Security Council acts decisively or unless the international community steps in to stop the aggressor, Iran will continue to defend its sovereignty and its people with determination. This is not only our right, but also our responsibility. Our response is solely aimed at deterring further aggression and preventing the repetition of such crimes. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Yemen.
يطيب لي في البداية يطيب لي أن ألقي هذا البيان.
I have the honor to deliver this statement, Madam, on behalf of the Arab Group. We thank Ms. Rochdi and Ms. Msuya, as well as Ms. Amna Khoulani, for their briefings. Madam President, the Syrian Arab Republic is undergoing a critical transitional phase marked by many challenges at the economic, social, and security levels, and this directly impacts the stability of state institutions and the prosperity of the Syrian people. Despite the complex nature of this stage, the Syrian government continues with its tireless efforts to enhance national stability, to consolidate reconciliation, and rebuild its infrastructure, paving the way for comprehensive development, ensuring the fundamental rights of all citizens without any discrimination. In this regard, the Arab Group stresses that the support of the international community for Syria's recovery and reconstruction, while respecting Syria's sovereignty and national decision-making and its independence, it is essential to create a stable and sustainable environment that meets the aspirations of the Syrian people. In this context, the Arab Group reiterates its unwavering stance in support of a Syrian political process led and owned by the Syrians that reflects the aspirations of all components of the Syrian population, including women and youth, and in this way safeguarding Syria's unity, independence, and territorial integrity. The group firmly rejects all attempts aimed at undermining Syria's state unity or interfering in its internal affairs. Our group welcomes the national efforts taken by the Syrian government to strengthen social cohesion, to consolidate civil peace, and to reinforce national unity. This is a pillar for a secure and stable future for Syria and its people. Madam President, Syria is facing considerable humanitarian challenges, and this requires an urgent and coordinated international response to support the Syrian government's efforts to rehabilitate infrastructure, to restore the national economy, and to implement early recovery programs. The group believes that meeting the basic needs of Syrian citizens and ensuring suitable conditions for the return of refugees and IDPs on a voluntary, safe, and dignified basis is an absolute priority at this stage. In this regard, the Arab group is deeply grateful to the countries that have hosted Syrian refugees over the past years and have borne extraordinary humanitarian burdens. However, the group stresses that this burden cannot be borne solely by these countries. Sufficient technical and financial support are required from the international community so that these countries can continue to fulfill this humanitarian role until the dignified and safe return of refugees to their homeland. The Arab group also emphasizes that Syria's reconstruction requires the removal of all obstacles hindering recovery efforts. These obstacles have significantly impacted and slowed economic recovery and has disrupted development efforts. In this regard, our group calls for the full and immediate lifting of all economic sanctions imposed on Syria. This is extremely important to help Syria in its sustainable development efforts. The group also welcomes the announcement made by the President of the United States of America regarding the lifting of all economic sanctions on Syria. This is a positive step that opens new possibilities for economic and humanitarian cooperation and supports the efforts of the Syrian government aimed at recovery. We also appreciate the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's efforts advocating for Syria's position in this matter, and we welcome the decision by the European Union to lift economic sanctions, including restrictions on vital sectors such as energy, transportation, and financial services, and also the decision to unfreeze the assets in the Syrian Central Bank and key financial institutions. These actions are crucial for reintegrating Syria into the global economy and strengthening reconstruction efforts. We also acknowledge the role played by Qatar in support of Syria's recovery, and particularly with regard to initiatives to improve electricity supplies and economic conditions. We welcome the joint efforts of Saudi Arabia and Qatar in settling Syria's outstanding debts to the World Bank, some $15 million. This will contribute to the resumption of the bank's support programs for Syria's economic recovery. Madam President, our group expresses its great concern over the continued violence in Syria. These acts are aimed at undermining the government's efforts to restore security and stability throughout the territory. We firmly condemn the repeated attacks by the Israeli occupation forces on Syrian lands. These are blatant violations of international law, and these aggressions directly threaten regional stability. And we call upon the Security Council to shoulder its responsibility and to compel Israel to cease its violations, to respect Syrian sovereignty, and to completely withdraw from occupied Syrian territory, including the occupied Syrian Golan. In the interests of regional security, we underscore the need to ensure international regional cooperation to combat terrorism in all its forms, including the efforts to counter ISIS and all other terrorist groups. We support the efforts of the Syrian government to secure borders, to combat arms and drug smuggling, and to strengthen national security. All of this will contribute to stability in Syria and in the broader region. Madam President, in conclusion, our group reiterates its full solidarity with the Syrian Arab Republic in its efforts to restore security and stability and to build a unified state with full sovereignty over the entire Syrian territory, and that meets the aspirations of all its citizens, and that enhances Syrians' position. We call on the international community to support the Syrian people in its efforts towards peace, recovery, and sustainable development, free from any foreign interference that might hinder that progress. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Yemen for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to extend our appreciation to Ms. Rochdi, Ms. Musuya, and country. This opportunity, if utilized effectively with concrete and consistent international support, including from this Council, can contribute not only to Syria's security, but to the wider region as well. Supporting the Syrian administration in its capacity building efforts is essential in this regard. Following the successful National Dialogue Conference, the announcement of a constitutional declaration, and establishment of a technocratic transitional government, the recent presidential decree on the formation of the Supreme Committee for People's Assembly elections marks another important step forward. In parallel, the establishment of the National Commission on Transitional Justice and the National Commission on Missing Persons further demonstrates the Syrian administration's commitment to establishing the necessary institutional mechanisms for peace, stability, and inclusivity. We believe that the only viable path forward for Syria lies in preserving the country's unity under a central government that guarantees the constitutional rights and freedoms of all its citizens, regardless of ethnicity or religion or sect. In the immediate term, revitalizing the Syrian economy is of utmost importance, alongside safeguarding the country's territorial integrity and national unity. As Ms. Rochdi mentioned, the deal signed between the Syrian administration and a consortium of Qatari, Turkish, and US companies to develop major power generation projects marks a crucial step in Syria's infrastructure recovery plan. Once completed, 3 projects are expected to provide over 50% of Syria's electricity needs. This is one of the examples Turkish companies are involved. Recent sanctions relief has opened the door for reconstruction efforts. It is essential that the international community supports visible and rapid improvements on the ground to prevent destabilizing interventions by third parties. Madam President, developments in Syria have been a source of optimism for our region and for the entire world. However, we must remain vigilant. Progress in Syria should not be derailed by negative developments in the broader region. In particular, it is imperative to ensure that the ongoing cycle of violence following Israel's illegal attacks on Iran does not engulf Syria. The destabilizing policies and continued aggression by Israel must be curbed. Israel's repeated airstrikes and incursions not only undermine Syria's internal stability, but also erode its capacity to combat Daesh, posing a threat to collective regional and international security. We reiterate our call on Israel to immediately cease its actions that violate Syria's sovereignty and threaten regional peace and stability. The full implementation of the 1974 Separation of Forces Agreement must be ensured by this Council. Madam President, it is also vital that terrorist groups are prevented from exploiting the fragile security environment. Turkey stands ready to cooperate with the Syrian administration to secure detention centers and camps in the northeast and to prevent any resurgence of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, particularly from Daesh. Future of Syria must not be held hostage by terrorist entities. Groups such as Daesh and PKK-YPG have no place in Syria's future. We remain deeply concerned that the so-called SDF has not adhered to the March 10 agreement with Damascus. Its continued actions further complicate the security landscape in Syria. It is essential that all terrorist structures are dismantled. All armed elements must disarm and surrender their capabilities to the Syrian state, and all terrorist actors must be expelled from Syrian territory. Seizing all forms of support to the so-called SDF remains the most effective means of facilitating the integration of northeast of Syria into the central administration, legitimate administration. Madam President, Turkey remains resolutely committed to supporting the Syrian people as they navigate this critical phase. We stand ready to work in close coordination with the Syrian administration regional stakeholders, and the international community, including this Council, to ensure that this window of opportunity of peace, stability, and reconciliation is not lost. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Turkey for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.